In the cold November days of 1940, inside the sprawling industrial complex of the Willys Overland plant in Toledo, Ohio, something extraordinary had just taken place. Against every reasonable expectation, against what most automotive experts would have considered impossible, the engineering teams had accomplished what seemed like a miracle of industrial determination. 75 days. That was all the time that had elapsed between the moment they received the government contract and the moment they delivered not one but two fully functional prototype vehicles to representatives of the United States Army. The engineers had worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts on cots set up near the assembly floor, surviving on coffee and sandwiches, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and professional pride that would define an entire generation. They called their creation the Quad, a name derived from its four-wheel drive system, though this technical designation would soon be replaced by something far more memorable. The vehicle that rolled off the prototype line was compact, utilitarian, and almost aggressively functional. Its boxy shape suggested no compromise with aesthetics, no concession to comfort, no acknowledgement that vehicles might serve any purpose beyond pure utility. The body consisted of simple, pressed steel panels, held together with exposed bolts that spoke of rapid assembly rather than refined manufacturing. There were no doors to speak of, just open spaces where passengers would climb aboard. The windshield could fold completely flat against the hood, transforming the vehicle's profile from already low to nearly invisible when viewed from certain angles. Nothing about this machine's appearance suggested it would become legendary. Nothing hinted that within a handful of years, enemy officers would risk their lives attempting to capture these vehicles, would prize them above nearly every other piece of American military equipment, would openly acknowledge that the United States had created something their own sophisticated engineering establishment could not replicate or match. Yet that is precisely what happened, and the story of how German attitudes toward the American Jeep evolved from dismissive contempt to desperate desire represents one of the war's most dramatic reversals of perception and reality. The story begins not with American triumph, but with German skepticism bordering on mockery. When the first photographs of early American Jeep prototypes reached German military intelligence offices in late 1941, the initial response among analysts and officers was one of dismissive amusement. The vehicle appeared primitive by European standards, as if American engineers had somehow regressed to an earlier era of automotive development. It had no doors, which seemed to violate basic principles of vehicle design. The windshield could fold flat, which appeared to be an admission that American factories could not produce proper glass installations. The body was a simple pressed steel shell with exposed bolts visible everywhere, suggesting hasty assembly rather than careful manufacturing. Minimal protection from the elements meant crews would be exposed to rain, snow, mud, and dust. To German military planners who had invested years developing the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, this American creation seemed amateurish at best, laughable at worst. One intelligence report dated from early 1942, discovered in captured German files after the war, described the American vehicle as appearing hastily assembled, lacking the engineering sophistication one would expect from a modern military vehicle designed to meet the demands of mechanized warfare. The report's author, whose name was redacted in the surviving documents, expressed confidence that German vehicles represented a superior approach to the problem of light military transportation. The tone throughout the document suggested not just professional disagreement, but genuine bewilderment that American engineers would pursue such an apparently crude solution. The Germans had considerable confidence in their own light vehicles, and this confidence was not entirely without foundation. The Kübelwagen had been designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself, one of the most respected automotive engineers in the world, a man whose technical genius was widely acknowledged even by those who despised the regime he served. The vehicle derived from the people's car that the Reich's leadership had championed as a symbol of German industrial prowess and social progress. Compared to early Jeep prototypes, the Kübelwagen was lighter by several hundred pounds, which German engineers considered a significant advantage. It featured a flat underbody that helped it slide over obstacles rather than becoming stuck, a clever design solution that impressed military evaluators. Despite having only rear-wheel drive rather than the complex four-wheel drive system the Americans had chosen, it performed admirably in testing conducted at military proving grounds. German engineers believed their approach was fundamentally superior from both technical and practical standpoints. Why waste precious resources, they argued in internal memoranda, on complex four-wheel drive systems when clever engineering and thoughtful design could achieve similar results with less mechanical complexity, lower weight, and reduced manufacturing costs? The Kübelwagen represented what German technical culture valued: elegant solutions that demonstrated intellectual sophistication rather than brute force approaches that simply threw more power and complexity at problems. This confidence in German technical superiority would prove to be tragically, catastrophically misplaced as the war progressed and reality brutally corrected theoretical assumptions. The American Jeep was not, despite German assumptions, a hastily assembled compromise cobbled together by engineers who lacked proper training or resources. It was instead the product of intense competition, brutal testing conditions, and ruthless refinement that eliminated any feature that did not contribute directly to functional performance. The story of how this vehicle came to exist reveals much about American industrial methods and military procurement processes during this critical period. In June 1940, as German forces were completing their stunning conquest of France and threatening Britain's very survival, the United States Army had issued one of the most demanding procurement requests in automotive history, a document that would later be studied in engineering schools as an example of how to write specifications that force innovation rather than incremental improvement. The Army wanted what they called a quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle, and the requirements they specified were brutally demanding. The vehicle had to carry 3 men plus equipment, travel cross-country in virtually any terrain short of cliffs or rivers, be simple enough that soldiers with minimal training could drive it effectively, prove rugged enough to withstand the abuse that combat conditions inevitably inflicted on equipment, and remain light enough that 4 soldiers could lift it when stuck in mud or sand. These requirements by themselves would have challenged any automotive manufacturer, but the Army added specifications that made the task seem nearly impossible. Wheelbase could not exceed 80 inches. Height could not exceed 40 inches with windshield folded. Weight had to remain under 1,300 pounds. 4-wheel drive was mandatory. The vehicle had to climb a 60% grade while fully loaded. Fording capability for 18 inches of water was required. Each specification by itself was achievable, but the combination created engineering challenges that seemed insurmountable. The deadline for the first prototype made the technical challenge even more daunting. 49 days from contract award to delivery of a working vehicle. Not a design study, not a mock-up, not a partially functional prototype, but a complete working vehicle ready for military evaluation. Most automotive manufacturers, upon reviewing these requirements and this timeline, declined to even submit bids. The challenge seemed too great, the timeline too compressed, the risk of failure too high. Engineers at major manufacturers calculated that developing a completely new vehicle normally required 18 to 24 months from initial design to working prototype. Compressing this timeline to 49 days appeared impossible. 3 companies accepted the challenge, and their reasons for doing so varied considerably. American Bantam Car Company, a small struggling firm in Butler, Pennsylvania that had been building miniature cars for a niche market, saw the contract as possibly their last chance for survival as a business. They had engineering talent, manufacturing facilities that were largely idle, and nothing to lose by attempting the impossible. Willys Overland, the larger operation in Toledo, had more resources and more experience with light vehicles, and they saw the contract as an opportunity to expand their business opportunity to leverage their existing expertise in new directions. Ford, the giant of American automotive manufacturing, entered the competition partly out of patriotic duty and partly because they possessed manufacturing capabilities that could scale production to levels the smaller firms could not imagine. The competition that followed was fierce and transformative. American Bantam surprised everyone by delivering the first working prototype exactly on the deadline, a remarkable achievement that demonstrated what focused engineering effort could accomplish under pressure. Their vehicle, designed by Karl Probst in an intense burst of creative problem-solving, met most of the Army's requirements, though it exceeded the weight limit by a few £100. The prototype demonstrated that the Army's vision was achievable, that a light four-wheel drive vehicle with the required capabilities could actually be built. Willys followed with their own prototype, which featured a more powerful engine than Bantam had used, a decision that would prove critically important. The Willys prototype used the Go Devil engine, producing 60 horsepower compared to the 45 horsepower units in other designs. This extra power meant the vehicle could climb steeper grades, carry heavier loads, and maintain higher speeds than competitors. Ford entered last, but brought their massive manufacturing expertise to bear on the design challenge. Their prototype incorporated features from both Bantam and Willys designs, while adding Ford's own engineering solutions. The competition quickly evolved from simply meeting specifications to determining which design could be most effectively mass-produced, which would prove most reliable under sustained combat use, which offered the best combination of performance, durability, and manufacturability. The Army evaluated all three prototypes through grueling test programs that subjected the vehicles to conditions far more severe than normal civilian use would ever impose. They drove them up impossibly steep hills, through deep sand, across boulder-strewn fields, through rivers and streams, over obstacles that would destroy conventional vehicles. In July 1941, after months of evaluation and testing that pushed every prototype to its absolute limits and beyond, the Army made its decision. Willys would be the primary contractor, largely because their more powerful engine provided performance advantages that evaluators considered crucial for military operations. However, the final design would not simply be the Willys prototype as submitted. Instead, Army engineers specified that the standardized design should incorporate the best features from all three competing companies. The body design would come primarily from Ford, whose engineers had created a more refined and manufacturable structure. Some features would come from Bantam, whose innovative solutions to specific problems impressed evaluators. The engine and drivetrain would be the Willys components, providing the power and performance that testing had shown to be superior. Ford would also build vehicles to the exact same specifications, creating a second production source that would dramatically increase manufacturing capacity. This decision to standardize on a single design that two major manufacturers would produce proved critically important. It meant parts would be interchangeable between vehicles regardless of which factory built them, simplifying logistics and maintenance enormously. The standardized quarter-ton reconnaissance car, designated the Willys MB and Ford GPW, entered full production in November 1941, just weeks before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would transform American involvement in the war from theoretical possibility to desperate reality. What emerged from the Toledo and Detroit factories was unlike anything the world had seen, a vehicle that represented American industrial philosophy in mechanical form. The MB and GPW shared absolutely identical specifications down to the smallest detail. Length measured precisely 132 inches. Width came to exactly 62 inches. Height with windshield erected reached 72 inches, which could be reduced to just 52 inches with windshield folded flat against the hood. Weight settled at 2,160 pounds. Heavier than the original specification, but justified by the performance advantages the additional weight enabled. The Go Devil engine displaced 134 cubic inches and produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute, impressive output for such a compact power plant. Top speed on paved roads approached 60 miles per hour, faster than most military vehicles of comparable size. Ground clearance of 8¾ inches allowed the vehicle to traverse terrain that would stop conventional automobiles. The four-wheel drive system, controlled by simple floor-mounted levers that any soldier could operate, used a two-speed transfer case that could be engaged or disengaged depending on terrain conditions. In normal conditions on roads or firm ground, the vehicle ran in rear-wheel drive mode, which improved fuel economy and reduced wear on drivetrain components. When conditions demanded maximum traction, drivers could engage four-wheel drive with a simple movement of the transfer case lever, sending power to all four wheels and enabling the vehicle to climb grades, traverse obstacles, and operate in conditions where rear-wheel drive vehicles would helplessly spin their wheels. Most remarkably for a military vehicle expected to operate in austere conditions, far from sophisticated repair facilities, the vehicle could be maintained in the field with basic tools that every unit carried. The engine had been deliberately designed for durability over precision, a philosophical choice that reflected American pragmatism rather than German perfectionism. Tolerances were loose compared to civilian automotive engines, which initially concerned some engineers who had been trained to believe that tighter tolerances always produced better results. In practice, these looser tolerances made the power plant more reliable under combat conditions, where dust, dirt, mud, and debris constantly threatened to damage precision components. Parts were completely interchangeable between Willys and Ford production, meaning a mechanic could grab components from any Jeep to repair another without worrying about compatibility or fit issues. The name itself, that simple four-letter word that would become synonymous with American military mobility, reflected the vehicle's versatility and the casual American approach to nomenclature. While debate continues among historians about the exact origin of the term, most agree that Jeep derived from soldiers' pronunciation of GP, military shorthand that stood for either general purpose or government procurement, depending on which quartermaster officer you asked. Soldiers testing early prototypes in 1941 began calling them Jeeps informally, possibly influenced by a popular Popeye comic strip character named Eugene the Jeep, a magical creature that could go anywhere and do anything, which seemed an appropriate metaphor for a vehicle that climbed impossible hills, forded streams, and kept operating under conditions that destroyed conventional vehicles. The name stuck through the organic process by which military slang becomes official terminology. When a journalist from the Washington Daily News rode in one of the early production vehicles in February 1941 and asked what it was called, the driver replied casually that it's a Jeep, and the article that ran nationwide popularized the term beyond military circles. Willys Overland, recognizing the marketing potential of this catchy name, moved to trademark it in 1943, though soldiers had been using it informally for 2 years by then. The legal formalization of a name that had emerged naturally from soldiers' experience represented a rare case where corporate interests aligned perfectly with military culture, creating brand identity that would persist for generations. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff whose strategic vision would shape American military operations throughout the war, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. A remarkable assessment considering the vast array of weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and equipment American industry would produce. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who followed American troops through the brutal campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, developing a writing style that captured the experiences of ordinary soldiers rather than focusing on generals and grand strategy, wrote that the Jeep was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It did everything, he observed, and it went everywhere. But these accolades came later, after combat experience had proven the vehicle's worth beyond any theoretical analysis or testing program. In early 1942, as the first Jeeps began arriving in combat zones around the world, German intelligence officers maintained their skepticism, unconvinced that American methods could produce equipment capable of matching German vehicles developed through years of careful engineering and refinement. The initial encounters between German forces and American Jeeps occurred in North Africa in late 1942 during Operation Torch, when Allied forces invaded French North Africa in what represented the first major American offensive against Axis forces. Thousands of jeeps landed with the invasion force, and German and Italian soldiers defending North Africa got their first close look at the vehicles Americans had been producing by the thousands in factories that German intelligence was only beginning to understand represented industrial capacity beyond anything European nations could match. The initial German assessment was decidedly mixed, reflecting both genuine observations and preconceived biases. Captured intelligence reports from early 1943, recovered from German headquarters in Tunisia after Axis forces there surrendered, acknowledged the jeep's speed and cross-country mobility, characteristics that were impossible to deny after observing the vehicles in action. However, these same reports criticized what German observers characterized as poor fuel economy, minimal armor protection, and vulnerability to mines and small arms fire, all legitimate concerns from a certain perspective. One report noted, with a tone suggesting both bewilderment and dismissal, that American forces seemed to have unlimited numbers of these vehicles, suggesting wasteful overproduction rather than recognizing that such abundance represented strategic advantage rather than inefficiency. The Kübelwagen, German analysts continued to argue in their reports, achieved similar mobility with half the horsepower and simpler mechanics, which from a certain engineering perspective was true. At German headquarters in Tunisia, where officers examined their first captured jeep in January 1943, with the careful attention military professionals give to enemy equipment, they found much to criticize through the lens of German engineering philosophy. The exposed engine compartment seemed vulnerable to damage from mud and debris, unlike enclosed German designs. The canvas top provided absolutely no protection from shrapnel or small arms fire, making passengers vulnerable to enemy action. The fuel tank mounted directly beneath the driver's seat seemed like a catastrophic design flaw, practically inviting disaster if the vehicle struck a mine or took fire from below. The simple three-speed transmission lacked the sophistication German vehicles incorporated, suggesting American engineers had chosen crude simplicity over refined engineering. But there were troubling observations that German analysts could not easily dismiss or explain away within their framework of assumed technical superiority. The Jeep's power-to-weight ratio was remarkable, undeniably superior to German equivalents. With 60 horsepower moving only 2,100 pounds, it could accelerate faster than almost any German light vehicle, reaching speeds that left Kübelwagens trailing behind. The four-wheel drive system, engaged through those simple floor levers that German engineers had dismissed as crude, worked flawlessly even in deep sand, the kind of terrain that had stopped German vehicles throughout the North African campaign. German mechanics examining the system were forced to acknowledge that while the design lacked sophistication, it functioned reliably and effectively, which from a practical military standpoint mattered more than elegance. Most disturbing to German intelligence analysts was the realization that Americans were producing these vehicles at rates that seemed incomprehensible, numbers that violated everything German planners understood about automotive manufacturing. Captured documents revealed production figures that German intelligence officers initially dismissed as propaganda, assuming American psychological warfare specialists had inflated the numbers to intimidate enemy forces. According to these documents, which were eventually confirmed through multiple sources as horrifyingly accurate, Willys and Ford together were building Jeeps at a rate exceeding one vehicle every 90 seconds during peak production shifts. Every 90 seconds, a complete vehicle rolled off assembly lines. German intelligence officers recalculated multiple times, certain there must be translation errors or numerical mistakes. There were no errors. By early 1943, barely 15 months after Pearl Harbor, American factories had already produced over 177,000 Jeeps, while German production of all light military vehicles combined barely exceeded 50,000 units. The implications were staggering and deeply troubling for anyone who understood industrial warfare. If American industrial capacity could produce reconnaissance vehicles in such overwhelming quantities, What did that suggest about tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, ships, and all the other material modern warfare consumed? The production ratio told a story that German strategic planners were only beginning to comprehend. The first reports from the field of German soldiers actively seeking to capture American jeeps rather than destroying them as enemy equipment came from Tunisia in March 1943, after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where German forces had initially pushed American troops back in confused fighting that revealed American tactical inexperience but also demonstrated American material advantages. Retreating Wehrmacht units, rather than destroying captured American vehicles as standard procedure dictated, took with them every operational jeep they could find. Officers wrote in after-action reports submitted to higher headquarters that the captured American vehicles proved invaluable for reconnaissance and command functions, assessments that began appearing with increasing frequency as the North African campaign progressed. The reasons for this preference became increasingly clear as fighting continued across Tunisia's varied terrain. The North African battlefield combined rocky mountain passes where vehicles had to climb steep grades while carrying full loads, deep sand wadis where wheels could sink helplessly without adequate traction, and coastal roads in varying states of repair where speed and maneuverability determined survival. German vehicles struggled across this varied terrain in ways that surprised officers who had expected German engineering to excel in all conditions. The Kübelwagen, despite its clever design features that impressed engineers in testing facilities, lacked the power to climb steep grades while carrying combat loads of ammunition, equipment, and multiple passengers. Its rear-wheel drive system, adequate when tested on specially prepared proving grounds in Germany, proved inadequate in actual combat conditions, where speed often meant survival and getting stuck meant death. Heavier German vehicles like trucks and half-tracks consumed precious fuel at rates that strained already overstretched supply lines running thousands of miles from ports to front lines. The American Jeep, by contrast, seemed purpose-built for exactly these challenging conditions that characterized the North African battlefield. Its powerful engine pulled it up grades that stopped Kübelwagens halfway up slopes, leaving German vehicles spinning their wheels helplessly while jeeps climbed steadily past. The four-wheel drive system maintained traction in sand and mud where rear-wheel drive vehicles dug themselves deeper with every wheel rotation. Most critically for German units whose supply lines were under constant air attack and whose logistics were collapsing, captured jeeps came with something German vehicles utterly lacked: access to abundant spare parts that American logistics made available even in forward combat areas. American maintenance depots held massive stocks of replacement components, which German mechanics quickly learned to raid whenever they captured American positions, keeping their stolen jeeps running indefinitely simply by taking parts from American supply dumps. This practical advantage outweighed any theoretical engineering superiority German vehicles might claim. A sophisticated vehicle that could not be repaired was worthless, while a simpler vehicle supported by abundant spare parts remained operational. By May 1943, as Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed and German commanders realized defeat was inevitable, the transformation in German attitudes was complete at the tactical level, if not yet acknowledged by higher headquarters. When General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the remaining Axis forces on May 13th, approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers entered Allied captivity, one of the largest mass surrenders in military history. Among the equipment abandoned or deliberately destroyed to prevent Allied use were several hundred captured American jeeps that German units had been operating, sometimes for months, as their primary reconnaissance and command vehicles. Allied intelligence officers cataloguing abandoned Axis equipment in the aftermath of the campaign's conclusion were genuinely surprised to find so many of their own vehicles among German motor pools. Systematic interrogations of captured German officers revealed consistent patterns that troubled American intelligence analysts who had assumed enemy forces would prefer their own equipment. Given the choice between a German Kübelwagen fresh from the factory and a captured American Jeep that had already seen hard use, officers overwhelmingly preferred the Jeep without hesitation. Some German units had been operating captured American vehicles for months before the final surrender, long enough that maintenance records showed these American vehicles often logged more operational hours than supposedly superior German equipment sitting idle for lack of parts or fuel. The fuel consumption issue that German intelligence reports had emphasized proved largely irrelevant in the context of logistics that were collapsing anyway. When fuel supplies were measured in drops rather than drums, the difference between vehicles that each consumed inadequate amounts became meaningless. The intelligence reports synthesizing lessons from North Africa reached German high command in Berlin by June 1943, and the conclusions made uncomfortable reading for officers who had built careers on assumptions of German technical superiority. American industrial capacity was producing vehicles in quantities Germany could never hope to match given resource constraints and bombing damage to factories. The American Jeep, initially dismissed as primitive and unsophisticated, was demonstrably superior to German equivalents for reconnaissance and light transport roles that were crucial for mobile warfare. German units were actively seeking to capture and operate enemy equipment rather than destroying it, suggesting serious deficiencies in Wehrmacht vehicles that procurement officers had assured would prove adequate. Some far-sighted German officers recommended accelerating production of four-wheel drive variants of existing German vehicles, attempting to match American capabilities, if not American quantities. Others argued more pessimistically that Germany simply could not compete with American industrial capacity and should focus instead on areas where German engineering still held advantages, like heavy tanks and artillery systems. The debate became moot before any decisions could be implemented. By mid-1943, German industry was struggling desperately to maintain production levels of any vehicles while facing increasing Allied bombing raids that destroyed factories, killed skilled workers, and disrupted supply chains. Introducing completely new four-wheel drive vehicle designs was impossible given resource constraints and competing priorities. Germany would fight with the vehicles it had, accepting inferiority in this area while hoping superiority elsewhere might compensate. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in American factories, Jeep production continued to accelerate beyond levels German planners found difficult to comprehend. By the end of 1943, total production exceeded 360,000 vehicles, numbers that dwarfed entire German light vehicle production for the entire war. The production process had been refined through constant improvement to extraordinary efficiency levels that represented American industrial philosophy in action. Workers at the Willys plant in Toledo could completely assemble a Jeep from raw components in less than 3 hours of actual labor time, a pace that would have seemed impossible when production began. Parts were manufactured in factories scattered across 32 states, then shipped according to precisely calculated schedules to assembly plants in Toledo, Detroit, and Louisville for final integration into complete vehicles. The standardization was so complete, so absolute, that parts from any factory anywhere in the supply chain would fit perfectly in any vehicle regardless of where final assembly occurred. A carburetor manufactured in Wisconsin would work flawlessly in a Jeep assembled in Kentucky, while an axle built in Ohio would fit perfectly in a vehicle completed in Michigan. This interchangeability, combined with production volumes that generated massive economies of scale, created logistical advantages that multiplied force effectiveness far beyond simple vehicle counts. Every Jeep anywhere in the world could be maintained using parts from any American supply depot, which meant American forces never faced the nightmares German logistics officers endured trying to match specific parts to specific vehicles from specific manufacturers using supply lines that stretched across a continent. Compare this elegant simplicity to the chaos of German logistics, where different vehicles required specific parts from specific factories, creating supply nightmares for harassed officers trying desperately to keep mechanically diverse motor pools operational with diminishing resources. The transformation in German attitudes toward the Jeep accelerated dramatically with the Allied invasion of Italy in September 1943, when American and British forces landing at Salerno brought thousands of Jeeps ashore in the initial assault waves. German forces defending Italy's mountainous terrain got their most sustained exposure yet to American mechanization and its implications for mobile warfare. In Italy's mountains, where roads were primitive when they existed at all and terrain was brutally difficult for any vehicle, the Jeep's advantages became overwhelming and undeniable even to the most skeptical German observers. German forces attempting to establish defensive positions in mountain terrain found themselves consistently outpaced by American reconnaissance units in Jeeps that could navigate mountain trails completely impassable to heavier vehicles or even to lighter German vehicles lacking four-wheel drive. German counterattacks that relied on tactical surprise for success found that American units were nearly impossible to surprise because Jeep-mounted patrols provided constant intelligence updates on German movements and positions. Every American infantry regiment had approximately 145 Jeeps assigned according to standard tables of organization, numbers that seemed incomprehensible to German commanders. That meant American commanders possessed mobility and flexibility that German officers could only dream about achieving with their limited vehicle allocations. A German regimental commander might have a handful of staff cars for officers and some motorcycles for dispatch riders, maybe a few trucks if logistics permitted. His American counterpart commanded a fleet of jeeps that could rapidly reposition troops to threatened sectors, evacuate wounded soldiers to medical facilities, move supplies forward to advancing units, and provide mobile communications linking dispersed forces. The casualty evacuation capability particularly impressed German medical officers who treated wounded American prisoners and heard their accounts of how quickly they had reached medical care. American jeeps could be instantly converted to battlefield ambulances by mounting stretchers across the rear seats, a simple modification requiring minutes. This meant wounded American soldiers could reach field hospitals within minutes of being injured, dramatically improving survival rates compared to German wounded who often faced hours-long journeys over rough roads in purpose-built ambulances that frequently arrived too late. Captured German medical personnel reported their genuine shock at how quickly American wounded received sophisticated medical treatment, transported rapidly from front lines in vehicles that could traverse any terrain at speeds impossible for conventional ambulances. The survival rate differences were measurable and significant, adding to growing German awareness that American advantages extended beyond firepower to every aspect of military operations. In December 1943, Generalleutnant Friedrich Schulz, captured near Cassino during fighting that had ground down German defensive positions, was interviewed systematically by American intelligence officers seeking German perspectives on Allied equipment and tactics. When asked specifically about American equipment that impressed German commanders, he stated flatly and without hesitation that generals in his service admired the Jeep more than any other piece of American material. It was, he said with the frankness of a professional soldier discussing technical matters with enemy counterparts, the vehicle they most liked to capture for their own use in operations. This assessment from a senior German officer with extensive combat experience commanding troops in multiple theatres marked a complete reversal from the dismissive intelligence reports of early 1942 that had mocked American engineering. By early 1944, captured jeeps had become so prized among German forces in Italy that special written orders were issued from Corps headquarters regarding their proper use and maintenance. Captured American vehicles were to be clearly marked with German military insignia to prevent friendly fire incidents, which were occurring with disturbing frequency as German soldiers shot at vehicles they assumed were enemy. Priority maintenance support was directed to units operating captured equipment, recognizing these vehicles' value. Fuel allocation for captured vehicles received priority despite their acknowledged higher consumption compared to Kübelwagens, a remarkable decision given Germany's increasingly desperate fuel situation. The reasoning behind this priority was coldly pragmatic and based on demonstrated performance rather than theory. A single jeep could accomplish reconnaissance missions that might require 2 or 3 German vehicles to complete, if German vehicles could complete them at all. Its speed, operational range, and cross-country capability made it more strategically valuable than German equipment, despite consuming more precious fuel per mile traveled. The intelligence value German units extracted from captured jeeps operating deep behind Allied lines was enormous and sometimes decisive for defensive operations. A German reconnaissance team in a captured jeep marked with American insignia could pass for friendly forces at distance, allowing infiltration closer to Allied positions before detection. The jeep's mechanical reliability meant fewer embarrassing breakdowns during critical missions deep in enemy territory, where mechanical failure meant capture or death. Operation Grafe during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the most dramatic and well-documented example of how desperately German forces wanted captured American jeeps for special operations. When the Führer personally ordered Otto Skorzeny, Germany's most famous commando leader, to conduct special operations behind American lines, creating confusion and disrupting communications, Skorzeny specifically requested large numbers of captured American vehicles, with particular emphasis on jeeps. The plan required German commandos dressed in American uniforms to penetrate deep behind Allied lines, spreading disinformation and cutting communications. Skorzeny calculated he needed at least 100 captured jeeps to execute the mission as conceived, and he submitted formal requisitions through military channels requesting these vehicles. German supply officers desperately scoured rear areas and contacted every single unit throughout the Western Theater that might possess captured American vehicles. Despite having the Führer's personal backing and therefore unlimited authority to seize whatever equipment existed, despite weeks of intensive searching across the entire front, they managed to acquire approximately 30 jeeps, far fewer than the minimum Skorzeny considered necessary for mission success. This shortage forced improvisation, with German vehicles hastily disguised with American markings and modifications attempting to make them resemble jeeps at distance. The fact that even with the highest possible political backing and unlimited authority to requisition equipment, German forces could only assemble 30 captured jeeps revealed how difficult they were to acquire intact and how effectively American forces were either recovering or destroying damaged vehicles. The commandos who received captured jeeps for Operation Greif found them remarkably effective for infiltration missions despite the operation's ultimate strategic failure. Dressed in American uniforms and driving genuine American jeeps complete with proper markings, German soldiers managed to penetrate surprisingly deep into Allied rear areas, causing significant tactical confusion during the opening chaotic days of Germany's last major offensive. American checkpoint guards became increasingly paranoid, questioning everyone regardless of uniform or vehicle, demanding answers to obscure trivia questions about American sports and entertainment that genuine American soldiers would know, but infiltrators could not. Some German teams successfully misdirected entire American units before being discovered and captured. The infiltrators, when interrogated after capture, consistently praised the jeep's performance in their mission even as they faced execution as spies for wearing enemy uniforms. They noted its speed allowed quick escapes when American troops became suspicious, its maneuverability helped evade hastily established checkpoints, and most importantly, its absolute ubiquity meant one more jeep among thousands attracted no special attention whatsoever. The operation failed to achieve its strategic objectives, but it demonstrated conclusively how effectively trained German soldiers could operate American equipment when given opportunity, suggesting German perceptions of the jeep's inferiority had been completely wrong. The jeeps themselves performed flawlessly in German hands during the operation, proving that perceived deficiencies reflected German logistics failures rather than engineering shortcomings in the vehicle design itself. The invasion of France in June 1944 brought American jeep numbers to levels that simply astonished German defenders who thought they had seen everything. Operation Overlord involved landing approximately 20,000 jeeps in Normandy during the first weeks of the invasion alone, numbers representing more vehicles than the entire German light vehicle inventory across all fronts combined. German forces defending Normandy's hedgerow country found themselves facing an American army with mobility advantages beyond anything they had encountered in previous campaigns. Every German after-action report from Normandy battles mentioned American mobility as a critical factor, often the decisive factor, in tactical outcomes. While German infantry divisions still relied primarily on horse-drawn transport for moving supplies and equipment, with only small fractions of their vehicles actually motorized, American divisions were completely mechanized, with every unit possessing far more vehicles than German planners considered reasonable or necessary. This fundamental difference in organizational philosophy meant American units could maneuver faster, concentrate forces more rapidly at decisive points, and respond to unexpected threats or opportunities more quickly than German forces whose movement rates were constrained by horses' walking speed. The Jeep sat at the center of this American mobility advantage, serving simultaneously as scout car, providing forward reconnaissance, command vehicle carrying officers between units, communications platform with radio equipment, weapons carrier mounting machine guns or anti-tank weapons, ambulance evacuating wounded, and general transport moving personnel and supplies. German officers captured in Normandy consistently mentioned American Jeeps when interrogators asked about equipment that provided significant advantages to enemy forces. Some provided specific examples from their own experience that illuminated the Jeep's tactical impact. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer reconnaissance battalion during the fighting, wrote decades later in widely read memoirs that he had personally used a captured American Jeep for several weeks after his command vehicle was destroyed by Allied aircraft, and he found it superior to German reconnaissance vehicles in virtually every measurable respect, except fuel economy, which had become irrelevant as German fuel supplies collapsed. The fundamental challenge German forces faced was that fuel shortages in France during summer 1944 made even captured Jeeps increasingly impractical to operate despite their obvious superiority. Even when German units successfully captured Jeeps intact during local counterattacks or defensive actions, operating them became progressively more difficult as fuel supplies to German units dwindled from inadequate to nearly non-existent. Some German commanders issued orders that captured Jeeps should be used only for the most absolutely critical missions where their capabilities justified consuming scarce fuel, while other missions would use whatever German vehicles still had fuel or revert to foot movement. Other commanders more pessimistically